I follow everything you do on X and I read your Substack. I believe personally, this is just my opinion, that you're the finest British political commentator that Americans should all be listening to on UK politics. And so I want to first know your journey because I know today, whatever views that you hold, you arrived at them at some point. There was a transition. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my political journey is actually rather unusual. I started my career in the universities, in some of the most elite universities in the UK. I used to give talks to some of the universities in the US, Harvard, Michigan, among many others. And I used to work a lot on issues around identity and belonging and why people vote the way that they do. And over the years, basically over the course of around 20 years, I really began to watch how the universities were responding to a number of really critical events. And one of them was the first election of Donald Trump in 2016, where I saw, as I'm sure many Americans can relate, to an outpouring of some pretty ugly hostility and intolerance on campus towards the many millions of people who had voted for President Trump. We also here in the UK had the vote for Brexit, which was a vote that was about returning our nation to being a sovereign, independent, self governing nation. And in the same way, many of my colleagues were pretty uh, hostile towards those Brexit voters, like Trump voters. And those moments really made me sit up and think, where was I working for a start? But then also, I saw many of my friends within the universities, conservatives, classical liberals, people who were critical of woke ideology, gender identity, people who basically didn't go along with this stifling consensus on campus. A lot of those people were either sacked or chased off campus by basically bullies, essentially. And many of those were my close friends. So as I went through that process, I began to really become quite skeptical about what we might call the elite consensus in Western societies that's basically pro immigration, pro international institutions, but never pro the nation state, which is supportive of woke ideology, which is basically soft on Islamism, which doesn't really want to control our borders, which doesn't really want to put tax-paying citizens first. And particularly in the UK, and I think Americans will relate to this given what's happened on your southern border, what happened after the votes for Trump and Brexit for me, which really did change my mind on a lot of issues, was the way in which our country completely lost control of its borders, despite being an island. We suddenly were faced with an invasion of illegal migrants on small boats. And we already had a large amount of immigration into the country over the last 20 years, but we also had a growing threat from radical Islamism within Great Britain, and nobody in Westminster seemed remotely in touch with the rest of the country when it came to those issues. So I started speaking out publicly as a university professor. I was one of the youngest professors in the country. And then last year in 2024, I decided, look, if I want to actually play a role in trying to give people a voice in this debate, in trying to put forward an alternative perspective, then I'm going to have to jump into this national conversation and lead the universities essentially, which is what I did. I didn't think you could remain a university professor and become, politically active. I don't think those roles go together, even though many of my left wing colleagues certainly do think those roles go together. And I decided to leave and I set up what is now the UK's biggest Substack. It's the fourth biggest politics Substack in the world. And it was really driven by a desire to speak up for people who were looking at the institutions, who were looking at the political consensus, and are just thinking, what on earth is going on? And where are all the people who are speaking up for me and looking like me and sharing my values? And that's why I set up the platform. And over the last, particularly over the last 12 months, we've had some enormous success with it. So that's my journey, basically.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will resonate with that story. Maybe they are professors or not, and they're in different fields, but there is this awakening, as we contrast that with awakening to be woke uh, uh, across the world. And I think that without President Trump, correct me if you think I'm wrong, that it wouldn't be happening the way it is right now.
Mm.
That American politics and President Trump specifically is sort of a torchbearer.
Yeah, I mean, I like this word zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, and I think across the West, not just in the US, but also in Europe, we've got enormous elections coming up in Germany. We've had enormous elections here in Italy and France, the UK, and I think they all point to how the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, is beginning to change. And I was struck by an interview with the big tech entrepreneur Peter Thiel not that long ago, in which he said, had Donald Trump lost the 2024 election, then 2016 would forever be seen as the outlier, as the fluke election. But because Donald Trump won 2024 and won it so convincingly, 2020 will now be seen as the fluke, as the outlier in this Trumpian age. Historians will come back and they will begin this era in 2016, and it will run who knows how long, maybe until 2029, maybe until 2034. Who knows what's going to happen after Donald Trump's term? And I think in a sense in Europe it's very similar. So this what is this new zeitgeist? I think it's about nation first. I think it's about protecting your own people. I think it's about being skeptical of liberal globalization, which hasn't worked at all for the working class in Western economies. I think it's about seeing through woke ideology, seeing that this is not scientific. This is not actually in the interests of our children. This is the opposite of what a modernized, civilized society should be teaching as kids. And I think it is fundamentally about a different conception of political power. I think when I look at President Trump and when I look at the parties doing well in Europe, I see a very different conception of politics, which begins and ends with the idea of popular sovereignty, that it is the people, not the elites, who are the true source of power, authority, and legitimacy. And I think that many elites who have dominated Western societies for much of the last 30 years have a very different conception of power. I think they literally think it runs from one group of elites in Washington to another in Westminster to another in Davos to another in some other capital city. And I think what Trump and Brexit, Nigel Farage here in the UK, and similar parties across Europe have in common is this notion of popular sovereignty, that they believe that the people are the true source of power
The
and
consent of the
authority.
governed.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think I don't always agree with everything he says, but I think there's a conservative commentator in the States, Andrew Sullivan, who actually backed Kamala Harris for some unknown reason at the last election. But he did make an interesting observation about the ruling class in the West, where he said what we're living through is the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s. And I think that really does convey what's happened here, because the people who dominate the institutions, who dominate the universities, who dominate the schools, who dominate the capital cities, who dominate the centers of economic power, who dominate the museums, the galleries, the publishing houses, celebrity culture. I think the elite class over the last 20, 30 years, they've moved so far away from the average voter, particularly on these issues of identity and belonging, that they've just left this enormous hole at the heart of our political systems, which, has obviously been really great news for Donald Trump. I think it's been great news for Brexit. I supported Brexit here in the UK. And I think now what you can see in Germany, watch the elections this month, what you've already seen in places like Italy and elsewhere, are voters saying, no, actually, we want political leaders who broadly share our values and our vision and who aren't going to go off on a cliff when it comes to teaching our kids all this crazy stuff or opening up our borders or not really protecting what it is that makes us a distinctive and special nation state.
I think that's so important to continually reaffirm the value of the nation state. I think it is slandered, if you will, by this idea that this is some brand new thing, that the nation state came after the fall of the great empires, great, I don't know if the Ottoman Empire was a great empire, but, and that the nation state was a mistake. And I think the question is, what do they want us to go to? If it's back to imperialism or to globalism? And that leads me to this. By the way, the nation state is biblical. You can go back to Genesis, and the nation state is there. It is not a new
Yeah.
concept. It's a biblical one. But um, I see two of the major forces behind what is happening, this radicalization of the elites, as one, globalism, because they seem to care more about, I don't know, they don't care about their people. And this is just very confusing when you hear Keir Starmer and others speak, you just say, did he say that? And same thing in America, you cannot believe that they really do not care about being British or being American and preserving each individual glorious culture within this tapestry of diversity in the world. But if you have so much diversity in every country, you end up with, they talk about it as, just we're one, the same around the world. Should France be France? Whether we like France or not, it should be French. And the UK
Definitely.
should be British. And I think
And
if,
I say that as an Englishman, Elizabeth. The French
right,
should definitely be French.
they should stay French, and Mexico should stay Mexican, and Chinese should stay Chinese. We want them all to have liberty, and we want them to embrace our Western values. But I don't believe that we should force or impose those Western values. But one thing we do say as well is that whether you're Marxist or authoritarian or whatever, you should still be Arabian and
Yeah.
Chinese and Bangladeshi or whatever. Um, and the
I think
prong
that's
is, go ahead.
Sorry, if I could just briefly on that, Elizabeth, because what you're saying is sparking so many thoughts. I'm worried I'll forget them before saying them. But of course, the nation state is fundamentally the only successful unit for organizing human beings economically and politically that we've really ever had. Now, today's ruling class would like us to go up a level to have supranational organization, but nobody's ever quite figured out how you can maintain social cohesion, political institutions, and a viable economy at that level. The European Union is one example of that, and it's been, I would argue, a disaster. It's tried to forcibly integrate European nations economically. Well, that hasn't worked for Southern Europe because the Eurozone economy has been built for the North. It's tried to integrate them politically. Well, that hasn't worked because it's got a glaring democratic deficit at the heart of its institutions. Its executive institutions don't give people a choice, a meaningful choice over who represents them. And that, of course, is why we ended up here in the UK voting for Brexit. But this religion of diversity, which you're referring to, is so important because diversity is the new conformity, which is in a way a paradox. But when the elite class says that essentially the only thing that defines you is that you celebrate diversity, what they are simultaneously saying is that there's nothing special about your community at all. To say that a nation is diverse, like America, is fine, but it's also like saying there's nothing special about America. And I think there are lots of Americans watching and listening to this show who would say, hell yeah, there's something special about America, including our distinctive history, our ways of life, our culture, and so on and so forth. And I think this is one of the problems with this new religion that we have had. And hopefully, touch wood, it's on the back foot with the re election of President Trump. But the religion among the elite class is one that really now has no serious interest in maintaining and protecting and promoting the borders of our traditional national communities because members of the elite class don't feel attached to those communities. A lot of research on this has shown they instead derive their sense of status from their educational achievements, from their values, from their networks with other members of the ruling class, and they just don't really see the nation as an important part of who they are. And Samuel Huntington, of course, the great American social scientist, when he wrote his book in the aftermath of 9/11, Who Are We? And he asked the question about America, who are we? And his answer was that, well, essentially the big risk here is, you know, America is losing its answer to that question. Partly, he argued, because of large scale migration, and he had very big doubts about Hispanic and Latino migration from mainly Mexico. But more fundamentally, he also pointed to what he called a denationalized elite in Washington, which was an elite class that basically wasn't interested in even asking that question, what is it that makes an American distinct? And in many ways, I wish Samuel Huntington could see American politics today, because watching Donald Trump's re-election, on the one hand, it made me realize how Huntington had been maybe too pessimistic about America. But the second thing that struck me was watching how many Hispanic and Latino voters voted for Donald Trump, right? And were saying, actually, no, we too think there is something special and unique about America, and we want to hold on to it. A lot of research in Europe that shows the same thing, which is that, the left assumes that minority voters just want this bland universal liberalism, this kind of diversity, yada, yada, yada. But actually, a lot of minorities also want Western nations to remain Western nations with their traditions, with their culture, with their heritage, because a lot of minority voters identify with those things too. And I think that point really came home to me watching Donald Trump's re-election at the 24 presidential election, because he not only doubled down on that big realignment that he got going in 2016, but obviously he expanded it. He won all of these new groups too. So the American dream is kind of being renewed, right?
It's
It's
like
being replenished.
another war of independence.
Yeah,
In a sense that we've been fighting, and we're just actually beginning the toughest part of that war. But it's glorious to wake up every day. My
well,
80
listen. I need you guys to open up a refugee route for British people fleeing our Labour
Do
government.
you
That's what
know
I
that
need.
I've literally been posting about that for some time, that we need to consider having special refugee status, fast tracking Brits to to come over here
I would be the
because
first applicant. I will be make me great again. Bring me over. Help me out.
there's so many things, and I'm so sad that you had your time crunch thing, because I literally could do a Joe Rogan with you. My list of observations and questions are pages long. We won't get there, um, but I'll have to have you back.
No,
The
I'll be back 100%.
the where do I go? W- I I think Americans look at the UK, look at all of the Western world, as something that we're concerned about, we fear for, not in a timorous way in the corner, but our hearts are broken seeing what's happening across the pond, and we want to go out and shake people. I'll say things on my Twitter or my X and say, Wake up, you idiots. What are you doing? Where are the men in England protecting their little girls? But I think we have a special affinity for Great Britain, the UK, all of y'all over there, because we have this connection, a history, and shared values. And what I ask myself all the time, and I think we've done it in America, can we ever restore what we've lost? Can we restore it and come out better on the other side of this great trial? And I look at the UK, though, and I can tell you that there are so many people that think that the imbalance due to this radical immigration agenda, both legal and illegal, um, that maybe you're lost. Give me some hope. Tell me what the thought leaders like yourself in the UK talk about over, a pint, and and what you think the average, well, we call him the average Joe here in America, the everyman, thinks. What is the hope? And can you really do it? And is reform the way that it's going to happen?
Yeah. Well, firstly, let me just give viewers and listeners a sense of the mood music in the UK, because I'm asked this question a lot, including by people in and around the new administration. I think JD Vance, the new vice president, has alluded to this in some of his speeches. This question of what has happened to the mother country, what's happened to Great Britain, to these islands. The answer is there's a first order problem and there's a second order problem. The second order problem is mass uncontrolled immigration, which has been really going at full steam for the last quarter century, which, especially since the COVID pandemic, has changed so that nearly 90% of the record numbers of people coming into Britain today are coming from outside of Europe. Nigeria, China, Pakistan, India. So not only are we getting very high levels of immigration that we've never really had before, but we're also getting more culturally distinct, if not, I would argue, incompatible forms of migration from outside of Europe, often from lots of Muslim dominated states, I would add. So those two things are really unfolding. Now, within that, we also have an illegal migration crisis where we've got more than 150,000 people entering Britain illegally on small boats from the beaches of France, and they are crossing, and we are allowing them to stay. I use the word invasion because that is exactly what it is. In the same waters where the boats went across for the D-Day landings while the boats are coming the other way, and they're full of mainly men under the age of 40 from countries like Afghanistan, Eritrea, Vietnam, and they're entering illegally, and we're allowing them to stay, and we're giving most of them asylum. So you've got this big immigration experiment. You've got broken borders. You've got the inability of our courts and our judges to deport foreign national offenders, which is what the US is now doing, which we can see the new administration rounding people up and deporting them. We can't do that because we are part of something called the European Convention on Human Rights. That's an international agreement. It means that European judges have more of an influence, more of a say than our own domestic UK judges. So that's a big part of the problem. But what is at the top of this mountain, Elizabeth? What's at the real heart of this problem is the first order problem, which all of that reflects. And that's an elite class, a governing class, a ruling class on both the established left and the established right in this country that does not understand this country, that does not really represent this country, that does not really like this country. And I say both the established left and right because it's a bit like America before 2016. You couldn't really tell much of a difference between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, right? There wasn't really much of a difference. They weren't really that distinguishable on the big questions of the day. It was only when Donald Trump came up and you said, oh, now I remember what real political competition is or what real politics is, right? Now, what we've got is what America had in 2014-15. We have a complete lack of genuine political choice, except one, which is Donald Trump's UK ally, Nigel Farage, and his new Reform Party, which is a party I speak at, and I'm not a member of Reform, but I indirectly support the Reform Party by speaking at its conferences and its events. And what Reform is saying is, if we want to if we want mega, if we want to make England great again, then we need an immediate halt on the mass immigration experiment. We need to leave any supranational institutions that prevent us from looking after our own people and keeping them safe. We need to build a completely new economy, which is not organized around a big fat state, which is inefficient, which is riddled by lots of debt, lots of expensive debt. And we need to start standing up to our enemies, not only China, but also many of our internal enemies, radical Islamists and others who are trying to dominate parts of our political system. And reform is really the only alternative to this consensus. And I keep saying to people on my Substack and elsewhere, you better get ready because the next general election in this country coming in 2029, this is the last chance to save Britain. And, when I'm out speaking at events across these islands, which I do almost weekly, you can sense in the room everybody gets this is existential. This is a palpable sense of crisis about where this country is and where it's going.
You know, when I look at how long your prime ministers, I someday I'm going to have you come back and give me a tutorial on British parliamentary government because I get confused. I do get confused. Like,
See what I can do.
I
Ping,
want
ping me
Keir
a question.
Starmer out, and I want you guys to figure out how to do that. And when you say 2029, that's scary to me because did all this multiculturalism and globalism start with Tony Blair? Was it him, or did it?
So the way I would tell this story is I would say we had the Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher revolution, which really ended for us in the mid 1990s. And that was followed by a second revolution, which began with Tony Blair and is basically still going on today. And that second revolution was really about ripping Britain open to globalism, to mass migration, losing control of the borders, putting big business before the interests of British workers, smashing the working class, both through economic globalization but also cultural globalization by basically importing millions of cheap migrant workers, which displaced the British working class. And it hollowed out the nation and it hollowed out our sense of who we are. So, and I still, I've written about this as a revolution that was overseen by both the established left and right because they are indistinguishable. They have both presided over this. And the lesson, America is so interesting for me because what's so fascinating, we had a big conservative movement in 2019 led by Boris Johnson, which was supposed to be a pushback to that revolution, right? And what's so interesting about it is he came in with this enormous majority in the House of Commons. He had a majority of like 80 seats. He could have done anything, okay? And instead, what Boris Johnson did was he basically carried on with this liberal, hyper progressive revolution. He let even more immigration into the country. He lost control of the borders. He was just basically a liberal parading as a conservative. Now, what's so interesting about that is Boris Johnson and the Tories gave the world a masterclass in how to win this big majority, but then how to lose it, because a few years later he was booted out of office. Whereas what I see now when I look at the White House and Trump too, I see the Americans giving the British conservatives a masterclass in not only how to win a massive mandate, to win a big majority, to take control of all the levers of power, but actually, more crucially, how to use that power to advance conservative causes, whether that is overthrowing gender ideology and men competing in women's sports, whether it's taking on the state, whether it's sending the military down to the border, whether it's deporting foreign criminals. And so the last 5 years have been so curious to me that we've had these two political realignments, and only the Americans, only the Republicans have really understood how to generate that political realignment, how to lean into it, how to mobilize it, and then how to supply it with these policies when you win an election. Whereas the British Tories, they won the same realignment after the vote for Brexit in 2016 as Trump won, but then they proceeded to kind of turn their back on all of their new working class voters, all of their culturally conservative voters. They gave them more immigration, more woke ideology, more
I
craziness.
don't know if this
And
is a
I'm just sort of
spiritual
saying
problem. It's
this is
crazy.
insane.
It's
Yeah, it's crazy.
lunacy. If anybody doesn't understand how you take a mandate and then you go with it, or else you have just made enemies about with everyone that you. But did Boris Johnson ever really believe what he said he believed? That's, I guess, a question for the ages. I if you
Well,
if you
just
could.
just briefly on that, Boris Johnson always saw himself as the new Winston Churchill, right? Okay, which is always laughable because Winston Churchill was fundamentally a patriot and he would always put this country first. Boris Johnson, who I briefed twice, okay, so I know him a little bit. Um, he is a bohemian liberal from the upper class, from Oxford, from Oxbridge, right? The kind of elite universities. And if you know that world a little bit, you will know that fundamentally those people tend to really only be interested in themselves. And for them, politics is more of a game, right? It doesn't really come with the sense of moral obligation to the nation. It's fundamentally a plaything. And he never really understood who would put him into office. It would be like, imagine now if Donald Trump and Elon Musk and you know, Kennedy and JD Vance and everybody. Imagine now if they turned around and they said, "Well, gee, thanks for the vote, everybody. Now we're going to give you more immigration, weaker borders, woke
We'd
ideology."
go
They're
crazy.
probably actually. The funny thing is, Americans wouldn't tolerate it,
No.
uh, whereas the Brits, we're too damn polite.
I know that's as I watch, because it's almost like watching a lab experiment, or you know the mating habits of the speckled whatever, and I watch and I think, why do they keep voting these people in? You can't even have a demonstration. I don't want to talk about the anomalous violent demonstrations, but you can't even have a demonstration or a really honest discussion about, yeah, well, maybe they're difficult discussions or subjects, but maybe they really shouldn't be difficult. Maybe reality is something that we should feel comfortable talking about. And there's all this, I don't know, politeness. And I started getting the feeling, and I think it's insulting. And so I'm fighting it. It's like, are you guys a bunch of wimps? Wusses? Are there men left in Great Britain? I mean, I've literally put that out there because I just want to wake
Well,
people up. Where are the men, says the Bible, and I say it to Great Britain.
well, the most popular party among all men in British politics at the moment is the Reform Party, and I think that the most popular parties among men in Europe, in Germany, France, and elsewhere, tend to be the anti-establishment parties. I mean, look, there is something going on in Western societies at the moment, which is about, I think, a lot of men, young and old, pushing back. I really do think that you can see it. You see it in President Trump's support among, not even middle-aged and elderly men, but also young Gen Z men. And I think you see it in the people that are turning up at Nigel Farage's events. And I I think, my hypothesis, and I've been pretty on the money over the last 15 years. I think this political revolution that we are living through, I think is going to go well beyond one presidential term in America or one shock election in Europe. I genuinely believe we are living through a wholesale correction in Western politics. And I think that correction is being driven by ordinary people from ordinary towns, often outside of the big cities, who are just simply saying, we're not going to go along with the status quo anymore. And their leaders might not be perfect, and the movements that they lead might not be the most effective, but people are saying, we're going to correct the system. We're not going to go along with what we had over the last 30 years. And I think in Britain that will come here too. 2029 is a long way away, but
And you
the
can't
you
throw
know
him
the
out before that. You can't, like, call an
um,
election. Do they
hmm,
do that?
right. Well, we can't. So under the parliamentary system, the only way you could ever get to that is if there's a vote of no confidence in the current government, and because the current Labour government has such a big majority, that is extremely unlikely. But that is not to say that Keir Starmer himself would get to 2029. He may fall into difficulty with his own party. There's already a discussion about why is this guy so unpopular? Well, I could give you a few reasons why, but the Labour MPs are saying, geez, why doesn't anyone in the country like us anymore? We've only been in office for 5 months. But I think, I'd be honest with you though, there were a few moments already where you can just get a sense of the mood in the country of things going a little bit dark. So we had obviously the tragic murder of three little girls who went to a Taylor Swift dance class, and they were murdered, and many more were injured by yeah, Southpaw, by the son of a Rwandan migrant who it turned out had downloaded Al Qaeda literature, and was, a crazy psychopath who should never have been in the country. And in the aftermath of that, there was an outbreak of unrest and rioting across the country. And in my mind, that frustration and anger, as I wrote at the time, wasn't actually only about the atrocities in Southport, which were horrific enough. I think for many people, that sense of frustration and anger was about the direction of the country, and this incident becoming a lightning rod for that. And that, I'm just saying that to say, the mood in Britain, I think you don't have to scratch the surface for long to really come across a febrile, angry mood among Brits who are saying, look, I'm paying my taxes, I'm playing by the rules, I'm respecting our rule of law, but we are constantly waking up to stories of people who shouldn't be in the country, who are breaking our laws, who are not respecting our way of life, who are not making any meaningful contribution to the economy. And a lot of Brits are saying we're sick of it and we can do better than
I
this.
think
And if
that
the elite,
frustration is understandable when I watch all the commentary that I see from and liberals, on the other side, and everyone is clutching their pearls, so horrified. I am not condoning violence. Okay, so there's the disclaimer. But what I will say is this, that real men, when they see little tiny, adorable little girls getting stabbed to death and 10 more stabbed, and they reach a point where in the olden days there'd be a war, a real war. We're glad that there's not a civil war in the UK. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is men should be protecting, and the government, and of course men and women in government, because I'm just using that as the traditional sense, should be protecting their wives, their sisters, their moms, or their mums, and their little girls. And when all of these men and moms and women are saying, I'm utterly disarmed. I can't even protect my own children. The government is getting in the way. They're actually facilitating this. What am I to do? Human beings are human beings. There is a point at which you explode. You may yell at somebody, right? For some reason, you may go out and break a plate or something. But then, there is a point when you see the slaughter of little innocents and the rape of tens of thousands of little girls, young girls, that frustration may actually come out. And my goodness, are we so civilized that we can't empathize with frustration boiling over? It sickens me, that
no,
response.
listen, it wasn't only, as you've just alluded to, Elizabeth, it wasn't only the Southport atrocities that really shone a light on how bad things have become in this country. It was also the rape gang scandal, where, it took Elon Musk to remind everybody in this country. I mean, so disconnected is the ruling class that it took a tech billionaire from America to jump on X and say, what on earth's going on here? Hundreds of thousands of young white working class girls since the 1980s have been raped or sexually assaulted by Pakistani Muslim gangs, who often, by the way, used in their mind the teachings of their religion to try and justify those attacks. And what was even worse than all of that was then watching our hapless Prime Minister Keir Starmer basically say to everybody, well, if you care about this issue, to quote him directly, you are jumping on a far right bandwagon. Suddenly, everybody in the country is far right for expressing concern about the abuse of young women and children who were in often the social care system, very vulnerable girls. And I do think, there is a strain in America, unlike Britain, unfortunately, unlike Britain. There's a strain in America where people just simply would not have tolerated that. And here we have become very complacent and weak, and we are hemmed in by these social norms and words like far right and racist, which have sort of infiltrated every facet of our national conversation. And I just thought to myself a few years ago, somebody just needs to tell this straight, and somebody just needs to be, really honest with everybody and tell them what's going on. And if that's going to be, me and a bunch of people in the Reform Party, then well, fine, that's
Well,
what
I
we
think
got.
that that's you're mentioning something there, because I was thinking about you and that you have a unique position. There are many great spokespeople in UK. Some are more working class, others are more educated sounding. But what I really admired about the way you address these subjects is you address them head on. There are too many that want to be what some would say polite, I would say weak and afraid, lack of courage, because your culture there is so afraid of, and I think it's the cult of multiculturalism that, when I
Mm.
watch your talk shows, before GB News, and everybody's afraid to say like the obvious stuff. Well, just shock in people's faces when you say maybe somebody who's wearing a full niqab should not be allowed to go in the bank or teach our British children because, there's maybe a problem with that. Are you a racist? No. Are you far right? Well, in America, everybody